Hello again, folks. This week, an article by Richard Raw got me thinking. And he writes, "The journey of Exodus, the journey that Israel walked, is an image of the journey made by every person who sets out to seek the divine presence. What happened to Israel is what happens to everyone who sets out on the journey of faith. In the book of Exodus, Egypt is the place of slavery, and the promised land is the land of freedom. And the journey from Egypt to the promised land, through the Red Sea to Sinai and across the desert, is a saga which symbolizes our own struggle towards even greater inner freedom, empowered by grace as we continue the journey. The story of Israel symbolically describes the experience of our own liberation by God and our growth toward universal love. The story of Israel's liberation has been used often to inspire people who have been oppressed and exploited as slaves or as the victims of discrimination, laws that limited their freedom and their opportunities, peoples who were denied recognition of their essential dignity, reflecting God's image, and their entitlement to being regarded with respect and being afforded justice. The huge sadness is that black people who in America and in our own country and in other places, I'm sure, who have felt that the story of the Israelites moving out of slavery in Egypt towards freedom and the promised land is a kind of picture of their own struggle, their own journey. It's a kind of allegory. The sadness is that black people so often don't feel properly liberated. The laws have changed very often, but black people continue to bear the brunt of white people's racism quite frequently, and black people still suffer considerably from poverty and unemployment and inadequate housing and inferior educational opportunities and proper health care and other social ills. Back to Richard Raw. The stories of Exodus make religious sense to people only to the degree that they are themselves walking a journey of faith. We can rather easily relate these stories to our own life and identify with the experience of Israel. We have to be willing to experience the Exodus in our own lives, to let God take us from captivity to freedom, from Egypt to Canaan, not fully knowing how to cross the huge desert between Egypt and Canaan. Life for people of faith becomes a time between promise and fulfillment. And in a sense, of course, the journey of the Israelites from captivity in Egypt towards the freedom of the promised land is symbolic then of our own journeys from the beginning of life through until the end of life. Between the promise and the fulfillment of the promise, there is a long journey, and it involves many struggles. Not only struggles, there are times of refreshment like oases in a desert. There are times of hope and joy and grace and celebration. More and more, when I read the Old Testament stories, which are so often about death and destruction, or at least involve death and destruction, I find that it is impossible to believe in the kind of God that is depicted there. And in recent years, I found it impossible to rejoice with the Israelites in their seeming victory over the Egyptians when they made it safely through the Red Sea to begin their journey towards the Promised Land, and the Egyptians who were pursuing them drowned. It doesn't sound as though it's the kind of thing that a loving God would do, that he would enable a group of people to escape to freedom and wipe out an army that is chasing them. We read, he, that is the Lord, clogged their chariot wheels, that is the chariot wheels of the Egyptians. He tossed the Egyptians into the sea. He caused the waters to cover the chariots and the chariot drivers, so that in due course the Israelites saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Fine for the Israelites, grim for the Egyptians. On Friday, I read an article by Josh Mentz. I came across him on the internet. He is a Jewish world blogger, and he says one of the biggest events of the Jewish calendar is predicated upon reminding the next generation every year of how the Egyptians were our cruel slave masters in a bondage that likely never happened. The reality, he says, is that there is no evidence whatsoever that the Jews were ever enslaved in Egypt. There is only the biblical story. There's no archaeological evidence. There are no historical records of such a period in the life of Egypt, or even in the life of the Israelites themselves, apart from the Old Testament story. And so Joshua Mentz says that it is hard to believe that 600,000 families, which possibly involved about 2 million people altogether, crossed the entire Sinai desert without leaving one shard of pottery with Hebrew writing on it. It is remarkable that Egyptian records make no mention of the sudden migration of what would have been nearly a quarter of their population if the Israelites had left Egypt at a particular time. There has been no evidence thus far of any of the expected effects of such an exodus. One can imagine that there would have been a huge economic downturn if the cheap labor that the Israelites provided to the Egyptians suddenly disappeared. If the Israelites escaped from Egypt, and the Egyptians no longer had those resources. One can imagine that there would be a huge labor shortage, and in fact a great crisis in the history of Egypt. And furthermore, says Joshua, there is no evidence in Israel that shows a sudden influx of people from another culture at the time that the Israelites were meant to have arrived in that geographical location. And so Joshua Mentz, who is completing a degree in international relations and Middle Eastern studies, he says that the entire Exodus story is just a metaphor. So it is not a true, accurate, historical record of what actually took place at that particular time. There's no benefit really from seeing Israel's exodus from Egypt after 430 years of slavery as a real historical event. And there's no point in celebrating the ruthless drowning of the Egyptians plus their innocent horses. It is of much greater value to see the entire story as allegorical. It's a picture of our journey from captivity into freedom. And in fact, it's a story, the whole Bible, really, the whole of the Old Testament is a story of Israel's movement from captivity towards freedom. Initially, the captivity is depicted as being the captivity of slaves who have vicious slave drivers under Pharaoh and who have a miserable existence in Egypt. But as the Israelites move through the desert on their journey towards the promised land, it's much more a case of the Israelites needing to become free of the ideas and the practices that keep them captives. And so mentally and spiritually, they need to be liberated. And so the whole of the Old Testament then can be seen as a picture of the Israelites moving towards freedom, becoming released from a lot of the stuff that kept them bound by their prejudices and by their ideas. And for us too, the story of the Exodus and the movement from Egypt to the Promised Land is a story of our journey, overcoming our struggles, our difficulties, growing as we move towards freedom. So the struggles that we have in our lives as we move from captivity towards freedom are not just the crises when we have undergone suffering because of illness or some devastating loss in our lives, some sort of disaster, but the struggles are also things like seeking God and seeking truth and having to abandon ideas and thoughts, preconceived ideas, prejudices, ways we thought, patterns of thinking before, the need to continue changing as the Spirit of God illumines our minds and our spirits and draws us on towards truth. We're on a journey from being captive to what Paul called the old sinful nature. We're on a journey from living our lives selfishly, perhaps. We're on a journey from a time in our lives when we just held on to old wounds and resentments. We're on a journey from being or thinking of ourselves as relatively self-sufficient and independent, and I can do it alone. We're on a journey from seeing people as belonging to particular groups and feeling distant from those groups and in some ways feeling superior to those groups of people. We're on a journey from allowing a time when we've allowed the world's values to dictate our attitudes and behavior. And we're moving towards the goal of being in a place where we are not compromising with the world's standards and values and attitudes. And of course, we never quite arrive in the promised land. We're always struggling as we are on this journey. We're on a journey from a time maybe when we've been totally focused on our own issues and concerns. We're on a journey from maybe a time when we've been too afraid to stand up for what we know to be the truth. We're on a journey maybe from a time when we thought of Christ as our own personal saviour, and maybe we had limited concern for the material welfare of other people. We're on a journey perhaps from seeing God as a being whose primary function is to meet my needs and to keep me comfortable and to rescue me from every danger. And so we're on this journey, and when we read the story of the Israelites moving from Egypt, slaves in Egypt, captive in Egypt, moving towards the freedom of the promised land, we see our own journeys. And just as the Israelites sometimes in the desert complained and said, we've got no water and we've got no food to eat and we'd much rather be back in Egypt, we also sometimes feel as though we're struggling as we continue this journey, and maybe we're longing for a stage of our lives when faith was easier, when things were simpler, when it wasn't so complicated to try to work out who God is and what God's will is and how to live my life now and that sort of thing. In an article from The Guardian, and this is some years back, but I also found this on the internet, it was written in 2014. It's an article called Man versus Myth. Does it matter if the Moses story is based on fact? And I'm not going to try to convince you that it is historically true, the story of the liberation of the Jews from slavery in Egypt, and the fact that Moses was the person sent by God to deliver them out of slavery. I'm not going to try to convince you that that is historically true or not historically true. But does it matter whether it is the event is rooted in history or whether it is just an allegory or a metaphor. Now, Janner Klausner, who is a British rabbi, she's a woman, and so she would not be allowed to practice as a Jewish rabbi in Israel. But she says, what matters to me is there enduring truth that will move me and move the people I'm involved with and give them and me liberation? And to the story of Moses, the answer is yes. There is an enduring truth if we see it as being a story representing our own struggles and our own growth and our own movement towards freedom. Egyptian and Assyrian documents mention the Hebrews as being present in Palestine much later on in history than the Exodus was meant to have taken place, and their entry into the Promised Land, the land of Canaan. In the scriptures, then, we look for enduring truths. We look for stories that in some way mirror our experience. We look for principles that are right for today. If we are going to seek to be liberated from captivity as we move on in our lives, we are likely to have to sacrifice some things, like the security of knowing, the illusion of certainty, the comfort of familiarity, which is what the Israelites had to do when they left Egypt. All of the stuff that was familiar was stripped away. And although their lives were miserable in Egypt, there was at least the comfort of having a known world and a known routine and regular meals and so on. It's all worth it, giving up the comfort of familiarity, giving up the security of knowing for certain. It's all worth it if the object is to become increasingly free and captivated by the dream of universal love. So, I wish you well as you continue your journey from captivity towards freedom. And perhaps it will really be worthwhile for us to consider our life journeys and major events that have taken place in our lives that have perhaps moved us in different directions. And perhaps to spend some time thinking about how you have journeyed, where you've come from, how you were perhaps captive, and how you have grown in your experience of freedom as you've continued this journey towards God and towards what Richard Rohr calls universal love. A place, a state, an ideal when the world is caught up in the mystery of mutual loving. Amen. And God bless.